Vampire Hunter D, Volume 23, Iriya the Berserker, written by Hideyuki Kikuchi, illustrations by Yoshitaka Amano. Beautiful Swordswoman. Chapter 1, First Part. Although the sun should have been high at that hour, a shadow seemed to hang over the world. No one recalled it now, but long ago in the Far East there had been a style of ink painting called sumie. When heavenly skill inspired its brushstrokes as it did now, the vermilion bowls of the twisted forest adorning a portion of the wilderness, and the mounds of rubble nearly hidden behind their wall, as well as the graves of marble and gold that towered at the end of a winding road that almost seemed paved with crystal, all seemed stained with black and gray chaos, sealed away in it, and letting out an impossible scream. In the motionless world of this picture, the rain alone continued to fall, and even that would eventually surrender the impression of movement, and even that of sound as well. It was the time when grays gently gave way to blacks, and there was some question as to whether anyone could tell the hour at a time like this. It was at just such an hour that a challenger appeared, a shape spread like a black stain in the incessant rain, and accompanied by the ringing of iron-shod hooves on the crystal road. It became a rider with black raiment fluttering behind him as he galloped along astride a black cyborg horse. At that point, a sound entered the world. It wasn't a shriek of fear from the inky tones at a horse and rider who were like darkness coalesced, but rather a feverish sigh, spilled at the sight of the gorgeous, pale countenance that drifted amid black garb, fluttering like the wings of a supernatural bird. Pounding through the silken threads of rain, the horse and rider passed through a gate into a graveyard, where marble and gold joined in designs convoluted and grotesque. From the gate alone it was evident the cemetery belonged to the nobility, and though its interior should have been guarded by an electronic brain, produced by the same science that had built interplanetary spacecraft, the place had been left utterly devastated. Actually, it was the sort of tableau favored by second-rate artists in the capital, who knew nothing of the frontier. Grave markers and statues of natural stone that had been exploded and burned by people from surrounding villages were almost unrecognizable, while lettering of inlaid gold and precious jewel ornamentation had been pried from grave markers of indestructible metal, which, despite all the violence and destructive force they'd seen, still presented a lustrous and unblemished exterior to the storm. If the nobles had so desired, they could have stopped even an army of humans numbering in the tens of thousands before it ever passed through the gates. So why they would allow trespassers to commit this destruction remained an eternal mystery. The clan's graves lay to either side of the path, and the truer their bloodline, the farther from the gate they were. And off in the distance was a great mausoleum that resembled a castle. The closer you came to it, the larger the other mausoleums and gravestones became. And before long the rider reached the end of the path, where he dismounted without the slightest hesitation, wound the reins easily around the trunk of a nearby tree, and set off on foot toward a massive door. His boots were silent in each footfall, and droplets of water fell with their paws from the edge of his wide-brimmed traveler's hat. The rider appeared to be in the habit of wearing it tilted slightly to the right. After staring at the name inscribed on the surface of the door, the rider spread the fingers of his left hand and put its palm against the door. "Here it comes," a hoarse voice informed him. The surprising thing was, the voice came from between the palm of his hand and the door that lay before him. "It's not the Viscount, though. It's a gravekeeper," the voice continued. "And a pretty tough one at that." The rider pulled his hand away. It was at that very moment that the door swung open with a groan. The shadowy form that burst from it slashed a sword down at the rider's head, but it was deflected with a mellifluous sound. And when the shadow landed on a gravestone across the path, it took on human shape. And when the shadow landed on a gravestone across the path, it took on a human shape. Every bit as tall as the rider, and the young man was shrouded in a green cape. His left hand was held far out in front of him with fingers spread, while his right had a sword held as far back as it possibly could. There was no opening in his defenses, nor would his deadly pose fail to exploit one in his opponent. In response, the rider had his elegant longsword in one hand, extended at eye level with his foe. From the vicinity of his left hand, there escaped an almost impressed remark. "Oh, now this is..." At the same time, the young man in green took a deep breath, his shoulders alone moving. "Just too perfect." The hoarse voice continued. Was that to say he was alive, and a skill too perfect to be taken by the blow to follow? The rider's sword gradually began to rise. His right arm moved slightly to the side, and when it halted, he'd taken the famous stance of a swordsman, holding his blade up beside his head like a baseball bat. Everyone knew that pose was an imitation. However, when it came from this rider, his beauty made his foes' recognition that they were gambling their lives lose shape like a heat shimmer, luring his opponents in like moths to the flame. The young man in green actually took a step forward. No, he advanced 2 paces. That he managed to stop there was a feat of incredible willpower. Squeezing the fingers of his extended hand into a fist, he spread them once more. It was almost as if he was going to claw at his foe rather than slash at him. He stood that way for a second. 2 seconds. "Not bad," the hoarse voice said. "Borrowed that trick from the nobility, did he? However..." A different voice finished that sentence. "Please, allow me to have this battle." It was the voice of a woman, and a young one at that. But neither of the 2 figures moved an inch, and the thread of murderous intent that bound them didn't slacken in the least. Paul, like a demon hearing a litany of prayer, the young man jumped, making a broad sweep with his left hand, a foot-long blade concealed in his sleeve zipped at the source of the voice. "D," she said, beginning a new appeal. "I don't want any compensation at all. Once I've slain him, I'll be on my way. I only ask that you please let me have this fight." The eyes of the rider, D, shifted ever so slightly to the side, catching sight of the speaker. The blade the young gravekeeper had hurled hung in the air. It had been caught an inch or 2 shy of the woman's eye by a crimson hand. From the elbows all the way to the backs and palms of her hands, she was covered by dazzling armor. There in the silvery curtains of endless rain, she alone called to mind a burning flame given human form. Her crimson cape was closed over the woman's chest, and her pale face was slightly downturned. Glowing red hair hung down to her waist, concealing the left half of her face. The clasp on her cape was a gold chain. Pieces of chain were also sewn here and there to her cape in no particular pattern, lending the worn, dirty fabric a certain charm. My name's Iriya. I'm a hunter. You could tell the prowess of a hunter by the tone of their voice, and the look in their eye, and the way they carried themselves. What did Dee make of her? When he stepped forward without a word, Iriya played her final card, saying, "He's my younger brother." Dee halted, his dark eyes reflecting her pale face before quickly shifting to the young man. "You get 1 minute." A voice of iron informed her. "You have my thanks." The woman's right hand slipped under her cape. What weapon did she have, and how did she use it? All her opponent's speculation on these accounts would be frustrated. "Pull!" The woman called out again. Blackness covered her face. The young man had shifted his left hand, which he still held outstretched. The shadow of his palm and 5 fingers covered the woman's face, robbing her of her sight. The eyes of the woman, Iriya, were locked in darkness. Not only that, but even the scenery around her darkened. Dee's black garb, and the gravestones, the trees, and the reflected light were all lost, each and every one of them sinking into darkness. "He's good," said a hoarse voice that no one would ever mistake for Dee's, though it certainly seemed to come from his location. Ahead of the hunter in a particularly dense patch of darkness, there burned the sort of animosity that would make anyone want to turn their face away. My, the hoarse voice said snidely. "There are 2 presences. Only one of them is all fired up, though. And that darkness, it's special, absorbing all signs of people, sounds, even movements of the air. He could be standing right in front of you, and you never even know it till he stabbed you." Even as it said that, the horse voice moved in a new direction, shifting a bit to the left. "Nice," the horse voice said. At that moment, what had happened in the depths of that impenetrable darkness? "It's over." Before the hoarse voice could even say that, the surrounding darkness was retreating as if it had just remembered it didn't belong there. And in the twilight ruins, Dee and the young gravekeeper who'd been left a corpse came back into view, as well as the warrior woman who lingered by the body. "Looks like someone might be dumb enough to shout for joy," the hoarse voice remarked with a ring of melancholy, as the lovely woman looked down at the motionless form of her brother. There wasn't a hint of sadness about her. "I suppose that's one way of winning." "The wine from the victory cup might taste a little bitter, though." The beauty, Iriya, murmured something. Undoubtedly it was the words to a prayer. Once the corpse at her feet had turned to dust, Iriya returned her blade to its sheath. The almost imperceptible wind carried the dust away. For long, only the young gravekeeper's clothes remained there, and that was when Iriya came over to Dee. No tears had left their tracks on her pale visage. "Thank you. With your cooperation, I was able to send my brother to a better place. Saying that alone, Iriya shifted her eyes from Dee's face to his left hip, for she'd heard the voice pensively muttering, "To a better place, eh?" "Do you believe in the Lord?" Dee asked. Iriya nodded. "If I didn't, I couldn't go on living." Perhaps it wouldn't have mattered what she replied. The figure of beauty in black walked back the way he'd come without so much as a nod. "The hair," she called out to him. When nobles turned to dust, the only part they left behind was hair, and that was used to confirm their identity. The person who brought it in would be paid the reward, regardless of who they might be. As she followed past behind Dee, Iriya said, "This is for you." "For letting me fight in your place. Please take it." "You're the one who did the work," Dee replied without even halting. "That won't sit quite right with me. Take it, please," Iriya continued doggedly. Suddenly Dee asked her, "And if I said no, what would you do?" "What?" "Would you resort to force?" This young man wasn't the sort to distinguish between men and women when it came to armed opponents. But this time his actions were a little out of the ordinary. Tension surged into Iriya's expression, and half of it still remained there as the beauty declared, "You're on." At her carefree declaration, a cry of "Wow!" rose from the vicinity of Dee's left hip. His lips hadn't moved a bit. "So," she continued, "how do we play this?" Her expression calm, and with a hint of what could be called daring, the warrior woman was ready to accept Dee's challenge. First part, end.